Good afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me. Or good evening and good morning, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to the 20th Annual Cameron Hollier Memorial Lecture. I'm Cliff Goldfarb. I'm the chairman of the Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection at the Toronto Public Library. And this is the second virtual Hollier Lecture. A year ago, Zoom seminars and entertainment events were a novelty. But now I'm sure most of you are Zoomed out and very much looking forward to live in-person Hug Old Friends events where you can go and sit quietly in a corner and chat with a friend. I said this last year, hoping not to have to say it again. Well, it's nice to have the convenience of participating in these activities from a comfortable seat in your own home. I'm also sure that most of you are eagerly looking forward to being, again, part of a large gathering without fear and without a mask. One advantage of Zoom that may survive the return to some type of normalcy is the ability for people from far away to attend our events. We're hoping to combine remote attendance with our future live events. This event usually serves as our annual meeting, so I'm going to take hopefully just a very few moments to tell you a little bit about the Friends and what we do. So Cameron Hollier was the founding curator of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection when it opened in 1971 at the Metropolitan Toronto Central Library on St. George Street. In 2002, to honor Cameron's memory, the Friends established an annual lecture to celebrate and recognize Cameron's preeminent role as our founding curator. A little bit about the Friends. We were formed in 1997 by a small group who wanted to find a formal way to help the collection to grow and become an even more valuable resource for Conan Doyle scholars, for the library, and for the city of Toronto. We are part of the Toronto Public Library Foundation, who provide us with a home and a great deal of support. We also receive great support from the American Foundation for the Toronto Public Library. We work with the library to enhance the collection. We act as a resource for the library on issues that may come up. We raise funds to purchase rare items for special projects and to enhance the collection and its facilities. We work to raise public consciousness of the collection, and we act as a resource together with the library staff in dealing with other public and private collections. We work with the Bootmakers of Toronto, our local Sherlock Holmes Society, and other organizations worldwide to promote the appreciation of Arthur Conan Doyle and his works. We're one of the few societies in the world dedicated to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, rather than his most famous creation. In fact, we actually have more members outside of Canada than inside. Our activities: we publish 3 issues of Magic Door each year. Our latest issue was mailed out a few days ago, and many of you will already have received your copy. I want to thank our new editor, Tom Yu, who has just finished his 2nd issue as editor, and he's already hot at work on the 3rd. Each fall, we publish the previous year's annual lecture. This year, we'll be sending out our 2020 lecture by Rebecca Romney, the well-known American rare book dealer, called Sherlockian Collecting, a tour of clever, creative, and weird pursuits. Today's lecture will be published next year. We're planning an event for the weekend of Friday. Oh, I should say, we were going to have an annual conference, a massive public event this weekend. But of course, we had to cancel it because we couldn't hold it in person. So it was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the collection. Instead, we're going to hold it on the same weekend next year, September 23 to September 25, 2022, together with the Bootmakers of Toronto, our local Sherlock Holmes Society, who are going to be celebrating their own 50th anniversary. And we have every reason to hope that this will be a live event. And please keep checking our website or our Facebook page for updates. We also help the collection to purchase items which are not within its budget. We've purchased or contributed to the purchase of several very important additions to the collection. We're always interested in receiving gifts or bequests for which the foundation can issue a charitable tax receipt. Those of you who have visited the Toronto Reference Library will know that at its east end, Mike, could you put up a slide, please? At the east end of the library is a walkway, which we were able 20 years ago to have the City of Toronto designate as Sherlock Holmes Walk. On the far side of that walkway, which hopefully you can see, is a long white painted brick wall owned by the Toronto Transit Commission, just dying for a special piece of art. I am very happy to announce that we have just reached a preliminary agreement with Street Art Toronto, the Transit Commission, the City Councillor's Office, and the library for a piece of public art celebrating the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection. The details are still being worked out, and more information will be posted on our website and on our Facebook page when it becomes available. We also work with the American Foundation for the Toronto Public Library to offer our American friends the opportunity to receive charity tax treatment for their gifts to support the collection. The American Friends, and especially their past president, Glenn Moranker, have helped us to make several major manuscript purchases for the collection. And I also want to thank Les Klinger, annotator extraordinaire, who is always supportive of the collection and the Friends. I'd like to take a brief moment to thank the members of our executive who work behind the scenes to carry out our activities. Our website at acdfriends.org is maintained by Doug Elliott, who manages to keep it up to date from his home in Sydney, Australia. I can't thank him enough for his dedication and his wise counsel on all matters. Thank you to our Vice Chair, Barbara Rush, and our Secretary and Merchandise Chair, Philip Elliott, our Treasurer, Peter Chant, and our Membership Secretary, Kathy Burns. I especially want to thank Mike Ranieri, head of the Bootmakers of Toronto, who helps us in many ways, including graphic design, and who is running this webinar today. And without him, we would not be on the air, I can tell you. I especially want to thank Mike. Thanks to the Toronto Public Library Foundation, especially Jennifer Jones as president, and all of their hardworking staff for all of the material support and encouragement they give us. It's very much appreciated. Finally, thank you to the special collections staff who are responsible for our wonderful Arthur Conan Doyle collection. Allison Lennox, the manager of service development and special collections, our former curator, Peggy Perdue, now the senior department head of special collections, and our curator, Jessie Amalo, for the enthusiasm and skill she brings to her position every day. You're going to hear from her in a bit. You can visit us on our Facebook page, where there's always a lively discussion or two, and our YouTube channel, where today's lecture will be posted in the next few weeks. You can find both from the links on our website. I invite you to consider becoming a member of the Friends. You can find all of the information on our website at acdfriends.org. Click on Become a Friend. You can also find us from the link on our Facebook page. The reference library, I'm very happy to say, including the Conan Doyle Collection and the other branches of the Toronto Public Library, which has at least 100 branches, have recently reopened for the public. So I'm very proud and pleased about that, because last year we couldn't say that. And now I would like to invite our curator, Jessie Amalo, to give you a presentation on the collection.
Thank you, Cliff, and hi everyone. I'm Jessie. I'm Services Specialist and Curator of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection. It's nice to see you all virtually today. I've prepared a presentation that will give you an overview of the collection and some of the things that we have planned for the 50th anniversary of the collection. We have an exhibit planned for next year, which I will highlight in the presentation. But I also wanted to note that some of our rare items will also be on display next year during the Friends of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection conference at the library. And I hope you'll all be able to attend. And thank you.
Hi, everyone. I thought I would take this opportunity to tell you about the upcoming exhibit we have planned in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection. So without further ado, the title of today's presentation is Exhibit and gallery curation, preparation for a study in Sherlock and his creator, 50 years of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection. First, I will start with a bit of information about the collection. Housed at the Toronto Reference Library, the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection is one of the world's largest research collections devoted to Arthur Conan Doyle's life and works. Many of our 25,000 items relate to Conan Doyle's most famous character, Sherlock Holmes. It also has a range of Conan Doyle's fiction and nonfiction. Collection materials include manuscripts and correspondence, various editions and translations, parodies and pastiches, biographies, criticisms and bibliographies, periodicals, stage and screen adaptations, photographs, and collectibles. As mentioned, in celebration of the 50th anniversary of the collection, we are working on an exhibit. But first, I wanted to give you some background on the process and planning for library exhibits in general. So why do we do exhibits anyways? There are three main reasons. The first reason is access. Exhibits allow us to provide access to special collections materials that are otherwise non-browsable, and virtual exhibit components allow for long-term access, which can be seen after the physical show has ended. The second reason is preservation. Time permitting, conservators have the opportunity to assess, monitor, and treat items. It also allows conservators to make improvements to matting, framing, and housing of materials. The final reason is outreach. Visitors and library users can engage with the exhibits, tours, and other associated programming elements. Exhibits also provide opportunities for the library to partner with other cultural institutions, community organizations, and individuals. They also increase exposure, awareness, and usage of the library's special collections. And finally, they can be transformative, helping to create new knowledge and bring visitors to discover new meanings with the collection items and the larger ideas displayed. Overview of the exhibit development process. First, we start with an exhibit brief. This is where we consider the key ideas and what we want to convey, such as messages or objectives that support it. We consider what we want visitors to learn and feel about the topic. This is also where we consider the interpretive framework, such as how we want to tell the story and how will it be mapped out in the physical space. This is developed by the gallery curator, who oversees all of the gallery shows, and the exhibits curator, who oversees the collection. Following this is curatorship. Once the exhibit brief is in place, the exhibit's curator will do thematic research to develop a storyline and narrative, followed by collection research to see what items in the collection support the key ideas and themes. Then the curator makes material selections. The selection process can be lengthy and take numerous meetings to finalize. This is also where the text is written, including wall panels and captions. Next, we have design, which is where the look and the feel of the exhibit is created. Details including gallery colors, wall plans and graphics, writing font, panels, and case layouts are developed. There is also an exhibit's designer that is responsible for this. After this follows exhibit preparation. This is where the library's conservators and digitization staff begin to get involved. The conservators focus on treating items that require special attention, measuring, mounting, and framing items. The digitization staff become involved in digitizing items for virtual elements, creating physical reproductions for some items where there would be too much light exposure on originals, and graphic production. Finally, we have installation. This is where the conservators physically hang the artwork, install items in cases, and consider how to light materials. The design elements are also installed, including painting, wall graphics, wall panels, etc. Many staff with varying expertise are involved in the planning, approval, and implementation of the gallery exhibits, and the gallery shows often take many months to plan and come together. There is also always an accompanying virtual exhibit on the library website for those who are unable to attend. Now we'll turn our attention to the upcoming Conan Doyle exhibit, a study in Sherlock and its creator, 50 years of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection. This exhibit will showcase the breadth and richness of the collection and explore the many facets of the ever-popular Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle's other published works, and explore the public and private life of Holmes's creator. It will also highlight gems from the collection, including rare editions of the original detective stories, letters and manuscripts written by Doyle, and a sample of the many adaptations, translations, and parodies written by others, inspired by Holmes. The exhibit also includes items representative of the 4 key acquisitions, known as the 4 pillars, that served as the foundation of the collection. The following slides will show a few examples of the themes explored in the exhibit. The first and probably the most obvious is the original stories, first and early editions. The collection holds many first and early British, American, and Canadian editions. Items that will be on display include Beaton's Christmas Annual featuring A Study in Scarlet, the first edition of the first ever Sherlock Holmes story, Collier's Magazine, where 20 stories were first published in the US, Lippincott's Magazine featuring the first printing of The Sign of Four, and the first edition of The Hound of the Baskervilles. Another theme is Holmes on stage and screen. This section will include an assortment of posters, programs, stage designs, lobby cards, plays, and books, all related to the various theatrical representations of Holmes. It honors some of the many actors who best represented Holmes over the past century. Finally, we have Conan Doyle's Great Crusade, Spiritualism, which includes manuscript letters, spirit photographs, books, newspapers, Conan Doyle's psychic bookshop catalog, and more, all from his years of dedication to the spiritualist movement. These are just some of the many themes you'll be able to explore when visiting the exhibit. There will be over 100 items on display. You can visit the new show, which runs from January 22nd to April 3rd, 2022 in the TD Gallery at the Toronto Reference Library. We will also have a virtual exhibit on the Toronto Public Library website for those who are unable to make it to the gallery show. As a final note, I'd like to thank Nicole Dawkins, Gallery and Exhibits Curator at Toronto Public Library, for providing background on the exhibit process. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie. Wonderful presentation, and I can't wait to see that exhibit. I first met Jeffrey Hatcher when he was a speaker at a great Baker Street Irregulars conference in Chautauqua, New York in September 2016. At that time, he was finalizing a new play, Holmes and Watson. As an exercise, he asked the audience to help him cast the play, selecting audience members to read, sight unseen, sections of the play. For some reason I've never been able to fathom, he asked me to read for the part of Watson. The other audience reader Jeffrey selected was a tall, handsome, younger chap who just coincidentally happened to be a drama teacher with wonderful elocution. I won't trouble you with the result. Jeffrey Hatcher is an American playwright and screenwriter. He attended New York University to study acting and had a brief career on stage before turning his hand to writing. Time permits me only to give you a selection from his many award-winning plays, which have been performed on Broadway, off-Broadway, and regionally across the United States and abroad. This includes the stage adaptation of Tuesdays with Morrie, with author Mitch Albom, 3 viewings, Scotland Road, a Picasso, Korczak's Children, and some co-written plays such as Work Song, 3 Views of Frank Lloyd Wright, and Lucky Duck. He wrote the books for the Broadway musical Never Gonna Dance and the musical Ella. His stage adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, was nominated by the Mystery Writers of America for the Edgar Award for Best Play. As a screenwriter, he adapted his play Complete Female Stage Beauty for the film Stage Beauty. His other screenplays include Casanova, The Duchess, The Wonderful Mr. Holmes, not the name of the title of the movie's wonderful, and The Good Liar. For television, he's written for the Peter Falk series Columbo and The Mentalist. He's the author of The Art and Craft of Playwriting. Jeffrey is a member and or alumnus of the Playwright Center, the Dramatists Guild of America, Writers Guild of America, and New Dramatists. He's won numerous awards for his work. He was invested in the Baker Street Irregulars in 2018 as the 5 Orange Pips. He lives in Minnesota with his wife, Lisa. While Jeffrey is speaking, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can send us a question for him to answer at the end of his talk. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome Jeffrey Hatcher.
Thank you very much, Cliff. I appreciate that no end. I'm going to make sure that I'm all set up here. You can see me, I can't see you. I'm very pleased that Cliff Goldfarb asked me to give this year's Cameron Hollier Memorial Lecture. And I assume, as I always do, that my audience is made up of acolytes and interested parties whose expertise regarding Arthur Conan Doyle far exceed my own. I often feel that I'm the least knowledgeable person in the room, especially when I've been given the privilege to command the room merely than simply inhabit it. In this instance, the subject, Conan Doyle, playwright, was suggested to Cliff by Les Klinger. Now, I'm certain both Les and Cliff know more about Conan Doyle, playwright, than I do. So you may ask, why aren't Cliff and Les speaking today and I am? The answer, even if I know less than Les and Cliff, I am, unlike Les and Cliff, a playwright. Arguably, I have some insight into this tributary, if not cul-de-sac, of Conan Doyle's career. Well, we shall see. The notion of Conan Doyle playwright is somewhat foreign to at least the casual Sherlock Holmes fan. It's even a footnote to the most learned of Conan Doyle scholars. We know him as a novelist and short story writer, a man who dealt in prose fiction. But the difference between prose fiction and drama is like the difference between American English and British English. Although there are similarities in origin, the contrast in meaning and practice can be vast. Conan Doyle wrote 21 plays, which isn't bad, but he wrote 22 novels and 204 short stories, which took up huge amounts of energy. Why then, when he was so successful in the realm of fiction, would he wish to take on the additional burden of time and imaginative powers required to write and produce plays? Andrew Lycett, in his biography of Conan Doyle, credits his father with introducing him to the theater and the world of illusion. We know he attended plays in his youth, but that's like saying he went to the movies. Plays, musicals, recitals, operas were the cinema and television of the Victorian era. John Dixon Carr tells us that young Arthur spent a memorable Christmas holiday in London attending concerts in the theater. On successive nights, he saw The Road to Ruin, a comedy in 5 acts, and The Courier of Lyon, a melodrama and a jolly play, wrote Conan Doyle to his mother, then added in parenthesis, 5 murders. As an adult, it was London which again spurred his interest in plays. Lycett says of this period, the future of the novel and the theater were being decided. Cultural battle lines were being drawn between intellectuals and jocks. Conan Doyle appreciated the immediacy of drama and desperately wanted to make his mark in the theater. Here we pause to ask a question. At the time, when Conan Doyle was beginning to feel the first flush of theatrical ambition, say the early 1880s, what was the nature of the English-speaking theater? Now, as an experiment, I ask you over the next 10 seconds to think of a playwright, a contemporary of Conan Doyle's, who wrote in English, whose plays were produced and performed between 1800 and 1887. 10 seconds. Now, I can name only the following without resorting to the Google: Tom Taylor, Dion Bosco, and Augustin Daly. Dion Bosco wrote The Octoroon, London Assurance, and The Chagrin. Augustin Daly wrote Under the Gaslight, which includes the first depiction of a person being tied to railroad tracks and saved before the oncoming train arrives. Note, it is a man who's tied onto the tracks, and it is a woman who saves him. And Tom Taylor, he wrote Our American Cousin. known primarily as the play Abraham Lincoln Was Watching when he was shot by the actor John Wilkes Booth. Booth fired his derringer after the following line of dialogue was spoken. "Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sockdologizing old man trap." Which Booth knew always got a huge laugh, a laugh that would cover the sound of the gunshot. It would be like shooting someone during a performance of The Odd Couple, when Oscar says, "You leave me little notes on my pillow. We are all out of cornflakes, F you. It took me 3 hours to figure out that F you was Felix Unger." Aside from revivals of Shakespeare, the classics, and comedies from the Restoration, the plays that appeared on 19th century stages were disposable melodramas and comedies that have had little to no lasting power. Conan Doyle's ambition to write plays comes at a time when the British stage is just about to grow up again after years of frippery. It took George Bernard Shaw, using Henrik Ibsen as his guide, and Oscar Wilde using his own North Star to effect this revolution of the stage. But as revolutionary as these plays were in their social political concerns, they were written with conservative construction. Ibsen and Shaw used the tenets of the well-made play as perfected by the French dramatists Scribe and Sardou. The well-made play was a perfect contraption with beautifully crafted, albeit artificial plots, employing suspense, mystery, conflict, secrets, romance, and revelations to hold audiences on the edge of their seats for the duration of a few hours. Ibsen, Shaw, and Wilde knew that a revolution in form was not as important as one of content. Or, as Shaw said, "If you want to teach an audience a lesson, you'd better make them laugh or they'll kill you." Given the revolution taking place around him, how could Conan Doyle weave his way between the competing dramatic styles of the age? Lycett says that by nature and family background, he was a fantasist, but this trait had been tempered by the hunger for objective truth, which came from his medical training. He believed the theater was a medium for action, humor, and the unfolding of plot rather than for ideas. His own narrative technique tended to a variety of traditional romance that he soon concluded was at odds with the realism of the contemporary theater. Still, this didn't dampen his excitement at the prospect of having his name in lights. Conan Doyle was convinced that by taking a principled but commercially minded position somewhere between the two extremes of gritty social realism and melodrama, he could succeed. Now, strangely, when later the idea of staging Sherlock Holmes first arose, Conan Doyle resisted, saying, in terms of dramatic representation, Holmes's reasoning and deductions, which are the whole point of the character, would become an intolerable bore upon the stage. Lycett notes that in light of the character's successes, both in the theater and in the cinema, this was an example of Conan Doyle's poor judgment of commercial tastes. Now, I'm not going to conduct a comprehensive overview of Conan Doyle's playwriting career. That's been admirably, if not exhaustively, examined by others. Now, I want to look at 3 plays written by Conan Doyle, each of which is an adaptation. 2 instances in which the play is adapted from previously written material, and one in which the play served as material for a short story he would write later. The short story, A Straggler of 15, was written in 1891. Conan Doyle was fascinated, nay obsessed, by the Battle of Waterloo. He had a relative who fought in it. His father and grandfather drew depictions of the Duke of Wellington. A Straggler of 15 is the story of an old Army veteran, Corporal Gregory Brewster, reliving the glorious day of the Battle of Waterloo and his one brief, bright, heroic moment in the sun. The short story begins, "It was a dull October morning, and heavy, rolling fog wreaths lay low over the wet gray roofs of the Woolwich houses." There's a paragraph or more of scene setting to give an idea of the village. Stout women with thick red arms and dirty red aprons stand on doorsteps. Then we get a line of dialogue. "Old enough to know better," she cried. "If he ain't no sense now, I expect he won't learn much on this side of Jordan." "How old is it now? Blessed if I could ever make out." We are eavesdropping on an eruption of village gossip, what in the Music Man is called some pick-a-little, talk-a-little. The ladies are denigrating the old man for whom Mrs. Simpson cares, and are about to shuffle off to the public house when a young girl steps across the road and asks Mrs. Simpson if this is number 56 Arsenal View, and if Mr. Brewster lives there. The housekeeper is suspicious, critical of the young woman, then realizes she is Nora Brewster, come to look after her granduncle Gregory. "And a good job, too," cried Mrs. Simpson. "It's about time that some of his own folk took a turn at it, for I've had enough of it." So what we've learned is that Mrs. Simpson takes care of an old man named Gregory, is fed up with him, and now his grandniece, Nora Brewster, is going to take over the job. Nora goes into the house and for exposition happens upon a newspaper cutting describing Wellington's victory at Waterloo. Then old Gregory makes his appearance. Nora tells him she's there to take care of him, and for the next dozen pages, Conan Doyle gives his readers a lovely character sketch of an old campaigner on the day of the commemoration of the battle. The old man displays some of the complaints and repetitions characteristic of senility. Two visitors come by, a young sergeant and a colonel. Near the end of the story, Gregory takes a sudden turn for the worst. The doctor comes to shake his head in silence. All day, the old man lay dying, and then he lay peacefully, his eyes half closed, his hands under his cheek, as one who is weary. He called out, "The guards need powder! The guards need powder!" Nora and the sergeant go to the old man. He called out once more, standing up now, his blue eyes sparkling, his white hair bristling, his whole figure towering and expanding with eagle head and glance of fire. "Guards need powder," he thundered once again, "and by God, they shall have it." He threw up his long arms, sank back with a groan into his chair. The sergeant stooped over him, his face darkened. "Oh, Archie, Archie," sobbed the frightened girl. "What do you think of him?" The sergeant turned away. "I think," said he, "that the Third Guards have a full muster now." That's the end. The play version, titled A Story of Waterloo, or simply Waterloo, was written and produced 3 years later in 1894 and starred Henry Irving as Old Gregory. Whereas the short story has two settings, the village lane and inside Gregory's house, the play has one setting, the interior of the house, and it begins with Nora's entrance. There's no Mrs. Simpson to say unpleasant things about the old corporal. So instead of pick a little, talk a little to give us exposition, Nora does the exposition herself in an aside to the audience. "And this is Uncle Gregory's portrait. Why, there it is above the fireplace, the very same as we have it at home. And there is his medal by his portrait. Oh, how strange that I should have the house all to myself. Why, it's next door to being married. I suppose Uncle isn't up yet. They said that he was never up before 10. Well, thank goodness that housekeeper has lit the fire before she went away. She seems to have been a nice sort of party, she does. Poor old Uncle. He does seem to have been neglected. Oh, never mind. I've come to look after him now. Let me see if everything is ready for Uncle when he does come. Won't he be surprised to see me? Oh, dear old Uncle, doesn't his portrait look grand? They must have been awful brave men folk to dare to fight against him. I do hope I'll be able to make him happy. Oh dear, a knock. I wonder who it is. I suppose I must see." Now, this kind of soliloquy was old-fashioned even for 1894. A few moments later, the young sergeant enters, and that yellowed newspaper clipping will be brought into play. Says the sergeant, "Aye, it's a slip of old paper. There's the date, August 1815, written yellow ink on the corner." Nora says, "It's such small print." Sergeant, "I'll read it to you." And he reads the same information we got in the short story about the Battle of Waterloo and the heroic Corporal Brewster. Now, following that, the play proceeds almost exactly as the short story does, leading right up to the climax when the old man shouts, "The guards need powder, the guards need powder," then collapses and dies. The only difference being that the doctor is not called to give his opinion, making the scene more efficient and saving Henry Irving the cost of an actor. The other changes of note are a few more jokes having to do with the old man's repetitions and obsessions, which I ascribe to Irving's natural instinct to please the crowd. In the theater, there's a term called permission to laugh. It's the first joke or bit of business that tells the audience it's okay to enjoy themselves. In this respect, the play version is funnier than the short story, and there's no actor alive, especially not a grand actor manager of the sort personified by Henry Irving, who wouldn't want to hear and feel the laughs wash over him. Waterloo is a character sketch, a story without a plot. Now, how can that be, a story without a plot? Here's one definition by E.M. Forster, the author of A Passage to India. The Queen died, and then the King died is a story. The Queen died, and then the King died of grief is a plot. In the former, there's no causal connection. In the latter, there is cause and effect. That's how plot works. A performs an action which affects B, who in turn performs another action which can affect A or C, or both A and C, leading to yet another action and another as the protagonist moves through time, pursuing a goal or goals and coming upon obstacles. Waterloo is an adaptation of A Straggler 15, but it's not a dramatization because there's no drama in it. Goals plus obstacles equal conflict, and conflict is the driving, pulsing heart of drama. The characters in Waterloo have no goals, hence no obstacles, hence no conflict. Nora comes to take care of Uncle Gregory, and she does. People come to visit the famous Straggler of 15, and they do. They want to hear his stories, and he tells them. There are no dramatic questions in the play. A dramatic question like, will Hamlet avenge his father's death? Is Claudius guilty? How will Hamlet prove his guilt? The only question in Waterloo, unspoken but present, is, will old Gregory be alive at the end of the play? Now, there is a faint question implied in the possibility of romance between Nora and the young sergeant. We might imagine a future for them in which they fall in love, marry, and say, remember the day of the commemoration of Waterloo and the death of your granduncle Gregory brought us together? The play is the equivalent of a living illustration of the short story. Now, the dramatic opportunity that I think Conan Doyle missed was in not including Mrs. Simpson, the grumpy housekeeper. If the housekeeper had been there when Nora arrived, they could have had a nice bust-up. Nora could witness how the housekeeper ill-treated her uncle. She could have fired her on the spot, and we would have learned the exposition in the midst of their argument instead of in an artificial soliloquy. That would have been a scene of conflict and drama. Nora fires the housekeeper, but who's going to take care of Uncle Gregory now? And Conan Doyle points out in the story the difference between those like Nora, who respect the heroes of the past, and those who don't, like Mrs. Simpson. That's a moral distinction and an insight that would have been worth holding on to in the play. Now, to be fair, when the play version received its premiere at the Princess Theatre, Bristol on September 21st of 1894, it was a huge success. And Lycett calls Waterloo precise in its depiction of an old soldier's deprived living conditions, but basically sentimental and unthreatening to the social order. George Bernard Shaw, writing as a critic, was harsh, saying Conan Doyle's work had no place in the modern theater. It was sentimental and belonged to the world of the music hall. The second play, also an adaptation, is The Speckled Band. Now, we all know the story. Written in 1892, many of us know the stage version as well. I'm going to break this short story into 8 parts with a prologue and epilogue. In the brief prologue, Watson tells us that only the untimely death of the lady in question allows him to write this story. He also mentions widespread rumors as to the death of Dr. Grimesby Roylott, which tend to make the matter even more terrible than the truth. So, The lady in question has died, and someone named Roylott is dead too. And you could argue that this blows at least one of the story's major events. If you know Dr. Roylott dies, there can't be very much suspense about the end of the story, but it can be seen as deft foreshadowing of a different sort. It's not that Dr. Roylott dies, but rather how he dies and under what circumstances. After the prologue, we have part one, a Baker Street scene. Sherlock Holmes makes a deduction about clothes and a dog cart. We learn that the woman in question, Miss Helen Stoner, will be married soon, that her stepfather, Dr. Grimesby Roylott, once murdered his Indian butler, that he keeps animals, including a cheetah and a baboon, and that a few years earlier, Helen's sister Julia died late one night calling out, "It was the band, the speckled band," accompanied by a low whistle and a clang of metal. Helen is in fear for her life. She wants Holmes's help. She leaves, and soon after, Dr. Grimesby Roylott himself arrives, telling Holmes to stay off the case. Part two. Holmes and Watson travel to Stoke Moran. They see Helen Stoner take in the house and estate. In part three, Watson and Holmes go to the village inn, and it's here that Holmes utters the famous line, "It is a wicked world, and when a clever man turns his genius to crime, it is the worst of all." Part four is some reconnaissance outside the house. Part five takes place at the inn, where Holmes discusses the ventilator in the room, the smell of Dr. Roylott's cigar smoke, and the placement of Helen Stoker's bed. Part six, night. Holmes and Watson go back to the house. Here we have the hideous and distorted child who throws itself upon the grass with writhing limbs, Dr. Roylott's baboon. Part seven, inside the house, Miss Stoner's bedroom, the tense waiting, the ventilator opens, the smell of heated metal, the hiss like a jet of steam from a kettle, the sound of the night bird, the cheetah, the parish clock striking 1, 2, 3, then the arrival of the speckled band itself. Holmes strikes at it with his cane, and there's a cry from down the hall. Part 8, Dr. Roylott's bedroom, where we see the iron safe, the plate of milk, and the dead man, his eyes in a dreadful, rigid stare, and round his head a brown, peculiar yellow band, the speckled band. The strange headgear began to move and reveal itself, dead within 10 seconds of being bitten. In the epilogue, Holmes explains things like the bowl of milk, the whistle, the clang of the safe. It's a perfect Holmes adventure. Now, Conan Doyle wanted to call his stage adaptation The Stoner Case to distinguish it from the short story, but someone prevailed, likely believing the short story's popularity would be one of its primary calling cards, and so it was called The Speckled Band. When Conan Doyle decided to adapt the short story to the stage, he expanded it to a full-length play. This is always dangerous. A Holmes short story is completed to itself. Its narrative tensions are structured to satisfy the reader's attention span, calibrated to the time in which it takes to read it and the number of pages it takes to print it. A short story is like an episode of a television or radio drama, which explains why the Holmes stories are perfectly suited for 30 to 60-minute radio and television adaptations, but often fail when expanded to 90 minutes or 2 hours, the length of a full-length play. The Speckled Band has the heart of a one-act, but because of its condensed dramatic action covering, as we've seen, 8 locations, if adapted to the stage as a one-act lasting 30-odd minutes, this admirable economy would seem hurried, perhaps unintentionally comic. Still, Conan Doyle's decision to expand the narrative is understandable. It should be remembered that Conan Doyle writes The Speckled Band after his and William Gillette's play Sherlock Holmes. Having worked now with actor-managers of the caliber of Gillette and Irving, Conan Doyle had learned what a leading actor wants, and more importantly, what the audience wants. In an era in which full-length plays were in 3, if not 4 or 5 acts, including intervals during which the audience traipsed off to the bar while the stagehands made the complicated shifts, it was expected that a full evening in the theater took up more than 1 or even 2 hours. The play version of The Speckled Band was written in 1910, in 1 week or 3 weeks, depending on whom you prefer to believe. It was performed in 3 acts with 5 scenes. The first act takes place not in Baker Street, as one might assume, but in Stoke Moran, years before the action of the short story. The setting is the Great Hall, and the event is the coroner's inquest into the death of Violet, not Julia, Stoner. Here's a picture from Les Klinger's handsome Gassetting published edition of the script. Look at the number of actors on that stage. Henry Irving may have been tight-fisted about not paying for 2 actors to play the housekeeper and the doctor in Waterloo, but somebody was writing big checks for the Speckled Band. Admittedly, most of these actors didn't have lines, the theatrical equivalent of extras or supernumeraries. But it is as if Conan Doyle has decided to throw his audience, which of course includes his readers, a curveball. They expect the curtain to come up on a traditional scene in Baker Street, but instead it comes up on a wild, no-holds-barred argument at a coroner's inquest in a gloomy Great Hall. It also includes Dr. Watson, who is introduced as an old friend of the Stoner sisters. Enter Dr. Roylott, now named Rylott for reasons that elude me, and his Indian butler, no longer murdered in India, but now assisting the doctor for nefarious purposes. There is also a housekeeper somewhere between Mrs. Danvers in Rebecca and Frau Blucher in Young Frankenstein. Most noticeable is the character of Mr. Armitage, a local shopkeeper who doesn't believe that Violet's death was due to natural causes. So obnoxious is Mr. Armitage and his objections and appearance, I'm sure many audience members assumed this bearded rustic might actually be Sherlock Holmes in disguise. No such luck. The coroner's inquest brings in a ruling of cause of death undetermined. Act 2 begins with a scene also at Stoke Moran. It's 2 years later, and Enid Stoner is engaged to be married. This does not please Dr. Rylott. She decides to go up to London and see Dr. Watson and his associate, Sherlock Holmes. Now, a full 30 or 40 minutes of stage time, and Sherlock Holmes has not yet entered the story. Here I pause to be pedantic and remind us of the realities of the theater. You cannot say turn the page to the next chapter and say, here we are now in Stoke Moran, or on film cut from Stoke Moran to Baker Street. A bunch of burly people have to lumber on stage, deconstruct one set, and pull forward another. Act 2, Scene 2 finally reveals Baker Street, and there we meet Billy. Now, Billy, depending on how you look at it, is either that unnamed page from some of the earlier stories, or a new character invented for the William Gillette Conan Doyle play Sherlock Holmes. In any case, Billy is here to let us know that we are in safe theatrical hands, just like opening the door to find Miss Moneypenny tells us we're about to meet up with James Bond. Billy tells us Mr. Holmes has quite a number of cases on deck. Oh, 2 German princes and the Duchess of Ferrers, and the Pope's been bothering us again. Billy exits, and Watson has a short aside, in which he says, I wonder if he still keeps tobacco in that Persian slipper. Ah, yes, here it is. Then he smells the bottle of cocaine and remonstrates Billy, who replies, I've done my best to break him of it, sir. I didn't know that cocaine had a smell, but then my sinuses haven't worked since the 1980s. Holmes then enters, disguised as a workman. What follows is a quick change in which he exits and reappears seconds later in full Sherlock Holmes regalia, which must have been a neat trick in those days. What follows is a lengthy Holmes vaudeville as Holmes discerns various facts from Watson's appearance, and 3 clients enter, Mr. Holt Loaming, Mr. James B. Montague, who it transpires is actually a murder with whom Holmes is toying, and then Mr. Augustus Milverton, which is a little like having the Sheriff of Nottingham drop in on Robin Hood during a lunch break. In their exchange, the essence of the Milverton short story is suggested, comfort food for the audience. At last, Watson tells Holmes about the goings-on at Stoke Moran, and then Holmes has a wonderful speech in which about Dr. Rylott he says, Watson, you're making the mistake of putting your normal brain into Rylott's abnormal being. The born criminal is often a monstrous egotist. His mind is unhinged from the beginning. What he wants, he must have. Because he thinks a thing, it is right. Because he does a thing, it will escape detection. Finally, enter Enid Stoner. It has taken 40 pages of play script to arrive at the same moment Conan Doyle accomplished in prose with 1 page. She gives us the third explanation of her problem, accents, and with efficient but hard to believe speed, enter Dr. Rylott. He and Holmes have their confrontation. We get the wonderful moment in which Rylott bends the poker, but we don't get Holmes bending it back. According to R. Dixon Smith, no such prop could be procured. The scene ends nicely, though, with Holmes asking Billy to pack his things, including the cocaine, and Billy accidentally throws it down, the bottle breaking. Says Holmes, "You young villain, you've broken it." "You're a clever boy, Billy." Act 3 brings us back to the Great Hall of Stoke Moran. There's a melodramatic but inconclusive scene between Miss Stoner, the housekeeper, and the Indian servant, followed by Holmes's entrance, disguised as Peters, the new butler, with Billy dressed as his daughter Amelia come to spy on the house. Now, here we should probably note that the Speckled Band is not a stage mystery so much as it is a stage thriller. In a classic mystery or whodunit, the question might be, who is trying to kill Enid Stoner, or is Dr. Rylott the murderer? In the play, more so than in the short story, we are in no doubt that Dr. Rylott wants Enid Stoner's inheritance and will get it by whatever means necessary. Now comes the most interesting scene, and it has nothing to do with Sherlock Holmes. It's between Enid and Dr. Rylott. Says Rylott, "Look here, Enid, let us be sensible. I was too hot just now, but you must realize the situation. Your wisest and safest course is complete submission. If you do what I tell you, there need be no friction between us." He wants her to break off her engagement. Enid explodes. "I believe that you murdered my mother by your neglect. I believe that in some way you drove my sister to her grave. Now I am certain that you mean to do the same to me. You're a murderer, a murderer. We were left to your care, hopeless, helpless girls. You have ill-used us, you have tortured us. Now you've murdered one of us and you would do the same to me. You're a coward, a monster and fit only for the gallows." Rylott replies, "You'll pay for this, you little devil. Get to your room." He seizes her by the neck. If it were not for Holmes's interruption here, Rylott might strangle her then and there. You'd think this might be the end of things. After all, Holmes has caught Rylott at attempted murder. Instead, Holmes, still dressed as Peters the butler, says, "Hands off, Dr. Rylott." And to Enid, "You best go to your room, young lady. I'll see that you're not molested." Enid goes. Rylott approaches Holmes with a whip, but Holmes takes out his revolver, saying, "You'll please put down that whip." There is a kerfuffle, and Holmes, assisted by Billy, exits. Shots are heard outside, and we are told by the Indian servant that the new butler has shot Sheba, Rylott's dog. Rylott takes up his shotgun and says, "Shot my dog, by God, I'll teach him." The Indian servant stops him, though, saying, No, Sahib, he gone in darkness. What do you do? Police come." Rylott, realizing that he has bigger game, puts down his gun and tells the servant to keep watch outside Miss Enid's window that night. Curtain. This is a very odd scene ending. If I'm Enid Stoner, I don't care what Holmes says. I get out of that house. If I'm Holmes, I have Dr. Rylott arrested for attempted murder. If I'm Dr. Rylott, I sure as hell suspect this new butler isn't any butler, and I change my plans accordingly. Here, I think Conan Doyle has sacrificed believability for a flurry of violent action to bring an end to Act 2. It's good theater, perhaps, but bad drama. Act 3, Scene 2, finds us in Enid's bedroom late that night. Now, in the short story, Holmes has Miss Stoner sleep in another room, safely. Not so here. Conan Doyle and Holmes are placing the heroine in danger in full view of the audience, which is just the way we like it. Rylott comes to the door, and peculiarly, given that he has just tried to strangle her, Enid opens it. Rylott again tries to soothe Enid, saying things like, "If there is friction between us, and I don't for a moment deny that there is. Why is it you think I mean to hurt you? I could only have one possible motive to hurt you. Why not remove that motive? Then you could no longer work yourself into these terrors. Here's the legal paper I spoke of. All I want is your signature. So after strangling her and ceasing in his attempt only when his new butler pulled a revolver on him, Rylot tries again to play nice-nice. I may judge this incomprehensible in terms of realistic human behavior, but someone, perhaps Conan Doyle or the actor Lynn Harding, who played Rylot, are putting little speed bumps in the doctor's way, suggesting that Rylot has a less demonic character than Holmes has described, that after already having murdered Violet Stoner, he would prefer not to kill her sister. However, Enid refuses again. Rylot exits. Enid is alone, and we get an Edgar Allan Poe-like reverie of Enid's soliloquy. What is that tapping? Surely I heard tapping. Perhaps it is the pulse within my own brain. Is it the signal of death? It grows louder in the window. A man crouching in the darkness, still tapping. You might assume it is the Indian servant, but no, it's Holmes. He enters through the window. He has chloroformed the Indian servant. Watson enters, and the scene plays out very much as it does in the short story. There's the examination of the wall, the bed pulled, the bed clamped to the floor. When they find the ventilator, Holmes says, curious fad to ventilate one room into another when one could as well get the open air. Most original man, the architect. He's certainly right about that. Holmes makes a point of saying that the ventilator leads into the room of, quote, our cheery Anglo-Indian neighbor, unquote. I repeat the adjective, Watson, Anglo-Indian. I suppose this is to suggest Rylot's character has been tainted by his time abroad. Following this, there's the whistle and the clang. Holmes gives the snake a thrashing. It goes back whence it came. Suddenly, through the door stumbles Dr. Rylot in shirt and trousers, snake around his head and neck, calling up, save me, save me. He falls to the floor dead. Watson strikes once more at the snake, says, the brute is dead. Looking at Rylot, Holmes replies, so is the other. He tells Enid, there is no more danger for you under this roof. Quick curtain. Now, of course, Conan Doyle couldn't do what was de rigueur in a Holmes short story. He couldn't do the epilogue, the winding up explanation. In the theater, an epilogue is anticlimactic, but the sudden quick curtain does create a certain, what, quality to the ending. We have no time to process Dr. Rylot's plot, nor Holmes' turning of the tables on him. The quick curtain is theatrical, but less satisfactory than the story. Now, before we talk about the play, The Crown Diamond, let's talk about the short story that emerged from it, The Mazarin Stone. The Mazarin Stone is a problem child, one of the goofball stories in the canon. And once we take a look at the play version, which preceded the short story, I think we'll find out why. Both play and short story take place in one setting, the consulting room at 221B Baker Street. No other story in the canon is reduced to but one setting, hermetically sealed. It is also one of the few stories in which the main action of the crime has already taken place. Both feature a rather too colorful villain and his rather too stupid henchman. Both employ the famous mannequin reproduction of Holmes, which is rather too reminiscent of the bus that took Colonel Sebastian Moran's bullet in the empty house. The play, written in 1921, is a ramped-up, over-seasoned near burlesque. Its villain is Colonel Sebastian Moran. Now, why Moran? He was already known to readers of the short stories as Professor Moriarty's number 2, and had been dispatched by Holmes in the empty house. Are we to believe that the events of the Crown Diamond take place before the empty house? But how could that be, given that Holmes has Moran arrested at the end of the play, yet he's free, unencumbered, and going about London under his own name in empty house? Perhaps the reason was the air gun. It is suggested that Colonel Moran carries an air gun hidden inside his walking stick, which in the short story Mazarin Stone is referred to as loaded. but he seems to be about to use it to bash his Holmes head in. But even here, we find a peculiarity. If the villain is willing to shoot Holmes with an air gun when he sees the figure seated next to the window, why isn't he willing to shoot Holmes in the flesh when he enters the room? Is he that easily spooked? Is he that poor a shot? There's a suggestion that he might not wish to use the revolver he keeps on him for fear the sound of the gunshot will attract attention, but he's already been witnessed entering Baker Street. He was ushered in by Billy. He's already suspected of stealing the jewel. He's either very foolish or very daring, but never either at the right time. Both play and story depend on a villainous mastermind being particularly stupid and being assisted by a particularly stupid henchman. But one doesn't like the idea that so deadly a foe could also be so credulous a nemesis. Both the play and the short story depend on a significant reworking of the architecture of Baker Street rooms, changes that allow for a bow window and curtain, a second entry, and a waiting room. In the play, The Crown Diamond, Billy tells Watson that Holmes has been behaving peculiarly, that his primary concern is the stolen jewel, and both the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have been to see Holmes. This seems a stretch, but it's theatrical, bold-faced in primary colors, like when Margaret Thatcher called James Bond to congratulate him on saving the world again. Holmes enters and surprises Watson by being dressed up as an old lady, the first time this disguise was enacted. For my taste, we're already in the land of burlesque when he does that. The play has the lights going off and a lit sign appearing above the safe that reads, "Do not touch." This is first used for comic effect to distract Watson while Holmes changes from his old lady costume into his Sherlock garb. It's used a second time to explain the shift in which Holmes substitutes himself for his wax impersonator. On the whole, it's a carnival version of the detective and his talents. Because it derives from its stage predecessor, the short story, The Mazarin Stone, has an Aristotelian unity of place not seen in any other tale. Colonel Moran in the play is now Count Nigoretto Silvius in the story. Why the change? Is it because Conan Doyle, the short story writer, was more faithful to his chronology than Conan Doyle, the playwright? Did he respect his readers more than his theater audiences? As we know, The Mazarin Stone is one of the two Holmes stories written in the third person, although it is written from Dr. Watson's perspective. We often ask why The Mazarin Stone was written in the third person, and I think Billy gives us a clue. Since The Mazarin Stone was first written as a play, Conan Doyle felt that it was in the lineage of the Gillette Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes play rather than the written canon. Because of this, the subsequent prose version had to be separated from the works written from Dr. Watson's point of view, hence the third-person narrative. The presence of Billy in both the play and short stories is what in gambling terms we'd call the tell. Now, I may be disparaging of The Crown Diamond and The Mazarin Stone, but there are qualities to admire. The recycling of the famous bit from Empty House, the bust, now a wax dummy, is at first deflating, disappointing. We think that Holmes and by extension Doyle have resorted to repeating themselves, but a change is wrong. Instead of the villain being tricked by the dummy pretending to be Holmes, the villain is tricked by Holmes pretending to be the dummy, which is a nice bit of false bottom magic. The short story adds an epilogue with a character who does not appear in the play, Lord Cantlemere. Holmes plants the Mazarin Stone on Lord Cantlemere and makes it seem the old man will be hauled off to jail before revealing that he placed it on him. It's a prank and one that feels unworthy of Holmes. Why Doyle felt this epilogue was necessary to the short story can be explained only by the fact that in publishing as opposed to theater, one is paid by the word. This prank feels more like the stage Holmes than the page Holmes. The stage Holmes is prone to such crowd-pleasing jokes. And his nemeses in both The Crown Diamond, the play, and The Mazarin Stone, the short story, are unworthy of his prowess. By contrast, let's revisit Dr. Rylot in the play version of The Speckled Band. In the play version, and here we may credit Lynn Harding to a degree, but it's Doyle who wrote the words, Rylot struggles with his murderous impulses. Now, the quick way to Enid Stoner's fortune is to kill her. But twice or more in the play, Rylot begs her to relinquish her claim on the money, as if he wants to avoid doing to her what he did to her sister. The stage Rylot thrashes about, pulled this way and that by his tortured, conflicting passions. Of course, it's also a way of elongating the playing time. As Orson Welles said of Hamlet, if the prince weren't indecisive, the play would be over in 20 minutes. I may criticize that one instance of Dr. Rylot's begging and imploring as implausible, but the stage depiction of Rylot is an example of drama as it would be practiced by Shaw, Wilde, and Ibsen, in which the obstacles are not simply exterior ones, like those in melodrama, but interior ones. A person wrestling with his soul, a villain trying to reclaim his better self. In the heaving, sweaty stage version of Dr. Rylot, Doyle gave his audience an antagonist of much greater complexity than the brilliant, frightening one readers encountered in the short story. True, his desires are evil and his hesitations momentary, but he is the closest Conan Doyle comes to creating a living human being, the kind of character who could take his place along Hedda Gabler, Henry Higgins, or Eliza Doolittle, a man in full. So, what then do we make of this occasional playwright? Arthur Conan Doyle was a theatrical prose stylist with a genius for dramatic storytelling, but undramatic in drama. He was a sensational writer, and I mean sensational in its original sense, in that his writing provoked physical sensations in the reader, perhaps as much as one of the genre's greatest practitioners, Wilkie Collins, did in novels such as The Moonstone and The Woman in White. I asked at the top why Arthur Conan Doyle went into the theater. To answer that, I'd like to look at the dramatic career of another almost unknown playwright of the period, Henry James. Now, as with Conan Doyle, I doubt most of us would say of Henry James, oh yes, Henry James, the well-known playwright. No, it's Henry James, the well-known novelist, author of Portrait of a Lady, Washington Square, Turn of the Screw, Wings of the Dove, and The Golden Bowl. But to do that, we have to admit entirely the 5-year period between 1890 and 1895, during which James endeavored with all his heart, industry, and imagination to become a successful playwright. Let me quote Henry James on the attractions of the drama. Playwriting, after all, is a craft allied to fiction, and I do believe the dramatist has always been here behind the novelist. Dramatic interest is essential to good novel writing. Give me dramatic compactness. One must create intense characters and show them in action. A play must never stand still. Let it not languish. Let not the story halt. The fine thing in real drama, generally speaking, is that more than any other work of literary art, it needs a firm structure. It needs to be shaped and fashioned and laid together, and this process makes a demand upon an artist's rarest gifts. He must combine and arrange, interpolate and eliminate, play the joiner with the most attentive skill, and yet at the end, effectually bury his tools into sawdust and invest his elaborate skeleton with a smoothest and most polished integument. The drama is like a box of fixed dimensions and inelastic material into which a mass of precious things are to be packed away. It is a problem and ingenuity of the most interesting kind. The precious things in question seem out of all proportion to the compass of the receptacle, but the artist has an assurance that with patience and skill, a place may be made for each, and nothing need be clipped or crumpled, squeezed or damaged. The false dramatist either knocks out the sides of his box or plays the deuce with the contents. The real one gets down on his knees, disposes of his goods tentatively, this, that, and the other way, loses his temper, but keeps his ideal, and at last rises in triumph, having packed his coffer in the one way that is mathematically right. It closes perfectly, and the lock turns with a click. Between one object and another, you cannot insert the point of a penknife. To work successfully, beneath a few grave, rigid laws is always the strong man's highest ideal of success. Now, to my mind, what Henry James is saying is that a playwright is a poet disguised as an architect. Now, it will come as no surprise if I skip the suspense here and tell you that it did not work out for James. On the opening night of Guy Domville, his fifth and final attempt at theatrical success, James stood in the wings as the audience called, "Author, author." James came onto the stage and they booed him. So why did he try? I co-wrote a play with Sandra Struthers called Author, Author, in which Henry James tries to explain his reasons. An actress asks him, "What is it about stage success that you find so irresistible?" Henry replies, "That it's so public. When you publish prose and it's successful, what you get is a note from your editor that says, 'Effort well received, sales not disappointing.' I want to feel it. In the house on opening night, at the party after, at the restaurant after the party. People." Andrew Lycett said Arthur Conan Doyle was an extrovert novelist who would always enjoy getting away from his desk and experiencing the glamour and financial rewards of the theater. When an audience later arose to its feet in appreciation of one of his plays, Conan Doyle recalled such moments to a dramatist give a thrill of personal satisfaction. The author of fiction writes alone in his study so that his stories will be published and enjoyed by strangers far from his solitude. The occasional playwright also writes alone in his study, but he writes plays in order to leave his solitude and enter the world of actors, directors, stagehands, the box office staff, the ushers, and the audience. Doyle wanted people. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jeffrey. I don't see any questions waiting. I see lots of chats, some of which one person has suggested that your discussion of the third person narrator in Mazarin Stone is a very interesting way of explaining the fact that some of the Sherlock Holmes stories were written in the third person and perhaps why. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I know that there's at least one other, right? Isn't it his last bow?
His last bow in the third person, and I think also isn't the resident patient or the devil's foot, not the devil's foot, the one with the jellyfish, the lion's mane.
I can only really address it in terms of this one because as I say, I think it's a little bit of a tell that in some way he knew it, the essence of the story, the plot, came from a different realm entirely, and so somehow that altered the way in which he felt he had to tell it. As other people note that there are scenes in it, or at least one extended section in which Watson does not appear. So, how could Watson know what was happening? Although I think that's fairly easy to explain. Holmes told him later what happened. As for the others, I don't know. I tend to always go with he made a mistake as opposed to being, something far more conspiratorial or twisty-turny. This always amuses me when it comes to criticism of really any work, when critics assume that what's written on the page or what appears on stage or on screen was what the author intended. And if you know how things are really put together, how things are written and produced and published and staged, you realize a lot of things are error, lack of time, all sorts of things. So I don't think my insight, if it is one, goes beyond at least the example of Mazarin Stone.
You may have just actually partially answered what I was going to ask you next. So Speckled Band, part of the reason it was written so quickly was that Conan Doyle had rented a theater and he was putting on a production of a play called The House of Temperley, which was adapted from his novel Rodney Stone, and it's all about boxing. And there were very realistic fighting scenes. Some of the boxers actually, some of the actors who played boxers were actually getting injured in the staging, and women were discouraged from going. And then to top it off, the king died. And there was a period of time when the theaters went dark. And here he was with a rented theater and nothing to put on it. And he wrote The Speckled Band. So whether it was 1 week or 3 weeks, it was extremely quickly done. And I'm wondering.
I think given that, I think he said it was 1 week and his wife said it was 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how nobody writes a play in 3 weeks. Nobody writes a full-length play.
Well, that was the question.
Noel Coward may be the only writer who once claimed to write an entire play, I think in a weekend. I think he said he wrote Blithe Spirit on the ship in Singapore Harbor while he had the flu. It's like, okay, if you say so. But yeah, no, that's I think it probably would have taken longer time if it was a completely new play. The fact that he was adapting something that he knew worked and that everybody already loved, he said, I got some great characters here. That probably made it a little easier for him. But as others have said, he'd learned a lot between 1894 when he does A Straggler, 15 Waterloo, and 1910 when he does Speckled Band. But I do think once you get to The Crown Diamond, it's really kind of a step back. The one thing that he seems to have learned and taken to heart in a good way is why not just do it in one set? One simple Aristotelian unity set. It does make for a kind of bangy kind of rough ride over the terrain, at least by my taste.
Yeah, well, Conan Doyle notoriously, good or bad, but he was wonderfully good at first drafts being pretty much final drafts. But don't you think with Speckled Band that if he had had a little bit of time and more time to get it rehearsed and see the effects, the equivalent of an out-of-town tryout on Broadway where you see what happens, that he might have.
Yeah, there's a story that Lynn Harding wanted some more changes. He wanted some changes to make Rylot more human, and that Conan Doyle said no, and it was kind of sulk about it during rehearsals. And without any due dialogue to play with, Lynn Harding starts adding bits of business. He gets this funny eye twitch, and he pulls his hair a lot. The idea being that maybe Dr. Rylot was an epileptic. And Conan Doyle asks J.M. Barrie, his friend, to come see a performance or a rehearsal, and Barrie says, let Harding do what he wants to do. So what I can't tell, though, is if then Conan Doyle did some rewrites, or if he simply said, okay, if you want to play him that way, play him that way. But it is interesting to see Rylot go back and forth, struggle a bit. It's melodramatic and it's a little crude, but it's not the same Rylot as we see in the story at all. It's probably what makes the story more perfect as a piece of art, as a work of art, but it makes the stage version perhaps more interesting as a work of character.
Could you see any of the plays that you reviewed today, the Waterloo, the Crown Diamond, and the Speckled Band, as capable of being staged in the modern era, with appropriate changes and fitting in the modern era, or are they just simply past history?
Well, Straggler, 15 Waterloo, you've done readings yourself, I think, over the last couple of years, and I think probably as a reading, you can get a sense of it, and that's useful, but I think it would be lost on modern audiences. The Diamond, because of its length, it is a weird little one act. You'd have to pair it with something, but it is awfully crude. It's as if it was written, by Conan Doyle when he was 10 years old, as opposed to the much more mature author that he really was in 1921. But I know that people do the Speckled Band. In fact, a friend of mine, David Whalen, played Sherlock Holmes, and there was a production still of it that I found on the net, and it showed the actor playing Dr. Rylot, doing the bendy thing with the poker. And I asked David, were you able to do the bit where Holmes bends it back? And he said, oh, no, because that wasn't in the script. But I thought, these days it's a little easier to, or you could fashion something that bent properly and then was put back in shape, but they didn't do it. That might be one thing that I would, add to the script. But I think the speckled band is done, and I think for a lot of people, it's a lot of fun. I bet they don't do it with that huge a cast playing the people at the coroner's inquest. There is no way to afford that these days, even if you paid the actors, cab fare.
Yeah, someone has asked if why the name changed from Roylott to Rylott, where Roylott sounds evil and Rylott not so much.
Yeah, I mean, Conan Doyle was great at names. The names are just incredible. I think only John le Carré and Ian Fleming and Charles Dickens rival him for wonderful names. So just to say Dr. Grimesby Roylott. I mean, Roylott sounds like royal, it sounds like rot. Whereas Rylott just sounds like somebody named Roylott sued him. Like there was a dentist somewhere in Edinburgh that said, if you put that on stage, I'll sue you, sir. So I don't really get why he changed it to Rylott. Somebody else might have insights, but I do not.
Well, I don't see any more questions, so I have the pleasant task of thanking you. I have to say that your accent displays that you might have made an actor and a fine one as Sherlock Holmes.
Well, I don't think, see, like you, I would cast me more as a what? See, when I look at you here, with the camera on you, I say, yes, very much a Holmes, very much a Holmes. It was in Chautauqua, I think we auditioned like 3 or 4 Watsons and 3 or 4 Holmeses. It's always in context. It's always in comparison. Are you a Holmes or a Watson compared to the Watson standing next to you or the Holmes standing next to you? I have a terrible feeling I would simply be Dr. Mortimer in Hound of the Baskervilles.
Well, it's not so bad. You get lots of lines.
Means I've got a dog and a stick.
And the best line in the play, the footprints of a giant hound.
Gigantic hound.
Yes.
If you put 5 syllables into hound, you've got something.
Well, this is, I have to say, a very different view of Arthur Conan Doyle than anything I can remember ever having heard. And I think it's safe to say that once this is published, it's going to be something the scholars are going to be looking at, and students of Conan Doyle, and maybe even students of the stage and the history of the stage are going to be looking at. So I think it's extremely well put together and researched, and expressing your own views, I think gives it some legs that I hope we'll be able to follow when it is published. It will be published, and it will be also, this will be on on YouTube. We will be able to see you and others who have presented today, Jesse and me. So hopefully this will have some longevity. I very much want to thank you. This has been wonderful, and I would like more than anything else to welcome you to the collection one of these days, and to have a look at what we have here in Toronto, and to be able to entertain you properly.
If a man walks into your collection wearing a mask that looks just like my face, you'll know it's me.
Okay, very soon, we hope. Thank you very much. I want to welcome and thank everyone who attended today. Hopefully you all appreciated it and enjoyed it as much as I did. And we look forward to seeing all of you in person in the near future. Thank you very much, and goodbye.